I
On Friday, the United States and the rest of the world were rocked by the events that happened in Paris. For those of us who have traveled to the City of Lights or who have an affinity for the City of Lights, the terrorist attacks that struck the people of Paris, well, they got to our heart. Today, for the podcast, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. Usually, for the senior seminar podcast, we talk about current events, broadly speaking, or we talk about concepts or ideas. But today, we've decided to turn our attention towards the West, towards the City of Lights, and towards our friends in France. And we're going to focus our conversation on what happened in Paris, what it means for the French, and also what it means for us in the United States. My name is Sean Williams, and I'm the instructor of political science here at Campbellsville University, and I'm joined today by three of our panelists. From my left to my right, Joseph Lowe, Lucas Costa, and Rebecca Hoffman. I do want to point out that because of rains that we've had here in the central Kentucky region, technology is a bit, shall we say, spotty. So we're going to do our best to work through the technology issues and hope that all the connections dry out before we get too far into the conversation. Thank you, everybody, for joining me. How are y'all doing today?
Good.
really good.
So first of all, I guess the best way to get started is to talk a little bit about maybe what happened in Paris and maybe a little bit about what's happened in the last few days. So does anyone want to start off there?
What we saw on Friday was an ordinary day for everyone in Paris, and then different locations within the city of Paris. We had different sites that were being targeted, either by bombings or shootings. And then as it goes on, we have a a dance club, who was attacked by terrorists, which exploded several civilians and killed several civilians in the club. And we had other bombings outside of a football stadium, which consequently led to more than 100 French and other civilians killed. And what we know is that those attacks were linked by the ISIS, the Islamic State organization. And now what we are seeing is the unveil of the actions that France and all the other countries in Europe are taking to deal with the situation of terrorist invasions and attacks in different locations in the world.
Would you guys, do you guys think that these attacks, have they struck a particular chord because the target was a European country? Is it because the target was Paris, which is sort of an international city? Or do you think it's something deeper than that? Why do you think it's been affecting, especially us in America, so much?
Well, Paris and France and America have always had a close relationship dating back to the Revolutionary War. Um, and as far as the events that happened in Paris and how they are resonating with not only Europe, but as you said, worldwide, Paris is a well-known city. It's very famous, and not just for its art, but its culture and how it impacts almost every facet of our lives, and how terrorists would attack that. It's almost like similar to 9/11, but it's Paris, and
We're
it's
yet to find a reason if Paris was a chosen location prior to the attacks, and what are the reasons why, or the fundamentals behind the attack. But as Joseph said, is Paris represents the city, a well-structured, um, secured city in the heart of France. And when we saw the attacks happening in several locations within the city of Paris, and with such a massive damage, we see a certain breaching the system, and that kind of shock society, Western society, or even the rest of the world.
There we go. The sense of shock, do you think that that was the fundamental purpose for why the attacks were targeted in Paris? Or do you think that maybe it was just a bonus, that the target was France itself rather than the entire international community, which is what appears to have happened?
I think it was deliberately done, based off of the government. The government had this, what his name was, Abu Maraka or Baraka or whatever. They had him under surveillance for over a year. They knew that they were going to do something. So for this, these terrorists deliberately knew what they were doing, and I don't think it was for show. I think their main target was to kill innocent people. They wanted to show more power. They thought that by doing this and killing innocent people, that this was their way of showing power, and we knew this was coming. And just like a couple days ago, actually last night, they said that now New York is going to be under surveillance. They are deliberately telling us what's going to happen, and instead of taking action about this and, precaution, we just sat back and just like, oh, okay, well, let's just keep going with our lives and just see what happens with the next type of threat they're going to make towards us.
I agree with Rebecca in the sense that it has to be, in my opinion, it had to be a structured attack. You see a lot of uncertainties being raised right now since you have this whole immigration crisis issue happening in Europe, and now people raising flags on whether was this because of European action towards Syria and all the refugee crisis happening, or is this a counter reaction from the part of ISIS to what's going on? And now several questions are being raised, or whether this is part of a bigger plan, and what we are seeing is the initial steps of the such execution, and that, like she said, is starting to raise concerns in other major cities such as New York, as we saw this morning.
And this attack was so planned that there was a test message that said, even from, there was like a phone that they had, a cheap phone that texts were, sent multiple times. It was so planned that they had direct destinations of where they're supposed to be at. They sent out test messages saying this is the day, it's about to happen. They knew where everybody was going to be, and they were amongst this France area for over a week, actually over an 8-month time period. They knew they had time to scope the area. They had time to watch everybody, knew what everybody was doing, so that when they made their move, they knew that it was going to be, out of nowhere, just blow people away. Because there was a video sent out where people were diving into a restaurant to get away from the shooting. Some people were laying on the ground just to play dead, so they wouldn't die. And people were just walking around with huge guns, just shooting people. And these poor people had to hide and just to pretend they were dead just to survive. And that's not fair. And that's just a horrifying thing that I just cannot get out of my head.
Well, ISIS is always looking for ways to legitimize itself, and this is just one way. And I think that this attack is a gateway to many others. It's very likely, very possible that ISIS is planning to involve the rest of the world. And right now, I don't think that we have any kind of valid response set up to these diverse and well-planned acts of terror.
Is it possible to have any kind of preventative measures for something like this? I mean, short of telling everyone who has dark skin or a funny sounding last name that they're not allowed to travel freely around the free world, what do you do to stop something like this?
I mean, obviously there are some measures of screening that can be taking place. Family history, if your family members have history of being involved in terrorist organizations or terroristic-like instances. You know, that can be done, but I'm not so sure that the U.S. and European countries have an answer to preventative measures for terroristic attacks, because it's not something you see coming. It's something that happens and then you respond. And
There's
that's
you know what you mean. I was just going to say that there are several profiling techniques that states like the United States diffuse with other countries that they might have applied prior to the attack, and having some sort of ethnical and racial label institutionalized to try to sort French civilians or natives from immigrants or any outsiders. But it comes to a problem where you see in the United States, in countries in Europe, for example, where they have this massive difference cultural background where you can't really tell apart whether you were born in a certain country or not, or you have these particular traits that belong to a specific identity, like for example Asian countries where you have this peculiarity. But now with those countries in particular, you can't really tell, and you can't really create a system where you can differentiate people from the others and then have them follow different lines and guidelines and tell them apart from their intentions or their acts.
And I
So
and I agree with you, Lucas. You can't, like you said, you can't find certain traits and say, oh, these type of people are terrorist-looking people. For example, if someone pours in a bowl of 1,000 M&Ms, and then they throw 10 poison ones in, and they tell you, go ahead, pull out a handful. You see what I'm saying? You can't differentiate who is a terrorist and who isn't, and you can't do that to people. And when we have all these, like for example, we have all these refugees coming in. What scares me the most is that for the example I just give, you don't know, who is bad and who is good, and you can't say, oh, you look like this, so you're a bad person. You can't do that. But I understand that we're supposed to show compassion and we're supposed to understand, but then again, we cannot show discrimination against the way people look.
I mean, there are definitely ways that you can tell certain traits apart from native-born citizens, but that will create the whole problem of not just telling them apart, but just historically, those countries have opened up their borders to different situations that have led to a intake of immigrants from other countries. And now, if if they were to come up with a system from telling them apart, it will mess up the whole history from their countries where they open up their own borders to immigrants.
The reason why they don't have the borders around the surrounding countries when it comes to France and all the surrounding areas is for exchange reasons. And I do agree that there should be some type of border. And because there was no borders, to collect passports and see documentation, that caused the terrorists to be able to transport themselves from one area to the other without being seen.
I want to come back to something that you mentioned a second ago, Ms. Hoffman. You had talked about the problem of the refugee crisis and the difficulty of having refugees moving into Europe or moving into the United States, and then you just kind of alluded again, the freedom of movement. One of the things that we've seen in the United States is this backlash to a plan to bring, I've heard numbers from 15,000 up to 100,000, but a backlash to bring refugees into the United States over the next several years. Do you feel that this backlash has been justified? Do you think that the response of many, especially particularly Republican governors, to just say keep all the refugees out, do you think it's justified? What do you think is going on there?
I think that, it's more of the reason why we are accepting all these immigrants into the United States. There's 26 states that are allowing immigrants to come into their states, and there are some. I think there's like maybe 6 or 9 that are not allowed to. I believe, but it's it's Congress and it's the administration that is allowing these refugees to come into these states, and we have Republicans and Democrats that are on the same side, and if we have Congress and administration, the House, I'm sorry, letting these refugees saying, oh, it's okay for them to come in, and then it gets to Barack Obama and he vetoes it. We have Republicans and Democrats on the same side, and when we have them on the same side saying that this is not right, I think we're going to have a really big problem. And when I saw it on the news that we were allowing people from Syria to come over into the States, it scares me, not because of what type of ethnicity they are or anything. It just scares me because we have these people that are in disguised terrorists that are in a surrounding area. And it's hard to depict who they are, and that terrifies me because I do not want to see something like 9/11 happen again. So I don't think this whole pushing the refugees into the states is correct.
But that creates the whole dilemma of whether were the attacks made by immigrants or people that were already been granted the permission to stay legally in those countries. If you see, for example, if you take the Paris terrorist attack that happened in Friday, a lot have argued that how come the immigrants, the refugees, they're escaping from the realities that they had, with no belongings, with their families coming in multitudes, be responsible for such structured attack, and then have Republicans in the United States using this as an excuse to create barriers for those immigrants. I know that they might have posed a threat in a sense of opening a door for such casualties, but you have to take in consideration that those attacks and this threat is something real for the people that have already been in the country and not the immigrants themselves, if that makes any sense.
Right, just to add on, I mean, we see immigrants and the capability of immigrants to migrate, and these are refugees, people who've lost their homes, lost their livelihoods, and have left all that behind to seek shelter and refuge. And any terrorist that is going to use that kind of route or means of transportation to go into a country and spend that kind of time and money, and one, they're easily identifiable. You can look for single males traveling alone and without families and identify them that way. Not stereotype, but there are screening processes available to weed out those who aren't terrorists.
And there's this misconception that people often forget about, is that a lot of the refugee camps, they have a jurisdiction really strong. And for example, in Spain, refugees have to deal with the economic crisis happening in Spain. And for example, they will have to deal with the unemployment that it's going on there. They have certain jobs that they direct the immigrants to. The food supplies, they're all really oriented and guideline to the immigrants. Everything that they do and everything that they receive from the government, it's being watched. So, and it's really focused in one particular site, which creates difficulties from them to pose a threat to the system.
And you have to remember, ISIS took over Iraq. ISIS took over Syria. I think what hurts us the most is that we underestimate ISIS. We underestimate what they're going to do. Their main goal for ISIS, honestly, is because they've taken over Syria, and they'll take any opportunity. And because France was a tourist state, and because right now the holidays where most people are traveling, they know that that's where everything was going. and we just overestimate them. We have to think that, you know, they see all these refugees coming into the United States. ISIS is going to try to intimidate and try to suck in as many refugees as they can so that they can, you know, do another attack like they have done in France.
Well, let's think about this just in terms of a pure risk calculus, and I'll get each of your opinions about this. I think clearly if we knew that half of all refugees who were coming into the country were terrorists or had the high potential of being terrorists, we would say, no, no one is allowed in, 50%, that's too much. If we were allowing in 100,000 refugees, but only one of them was a potential terrorist, is that still too much? If it was 50,000 refugees, but only one was a terrorist, 20,000 to 1, 5,000 to 1, what's the number? What's the number where we say we're safe enough, we can help people, rather than we're so concerned about our own security, we'll just let them all die?
I'm more on the side, the humanitarian side, where the countries should see that as an opportunity to embrace all the immigrants and have the chance to monitor all of them in one particular place and have a documentation or any sort of process that might lead the country or the officials to monitor step by step, even if there was one potential terrorist among the immigrants. And my opinion would probably be take the chances and instead of because
But
of
how
one.
much of a chance? I mean, let's put it to a number. I'm gonna hold you accountable for this. Ms. Hoffman had mentioned a second ago the number 1,000 M&Ms, and you throw in 10 bad ones, so it's a 1 to 100 ratio. What's the ratio that you'd be willing to accept? Is it 1 out of 10? Is it 1 out of 1,000? How much risk are you willing to take?
That's a difficult question to answer, because you look at it and you say, okay, these people are in need of homes and livelihoods because they've lost theirs, and then you look at, well, these people are of ethnicity and the religion that breeds terrorism. So I don't know, if it was left up to me, I would say I would feel comfortable with a 1 to 10,000 ratio.
Okay.
10,000 immigrants, one terrorist.
So then if you were a policymaker then in Washington, D.C., because this is ultimately how policy decisions are made, right? If you're a policymaker in D.C., you have to make some kind of a cost-benefit analysis. How strong does the screening need to be to make sure that I'm safe? So you're saying that if I can be sure that only 1 out of 10,000 of these people might be a terrorist, I may catch them later once they get inside, but only 1 out of 10,000 people might be a terrorist, you're okay with that protocol?
Sure.
It's really hard to come up with a ratio and not considering, for example, the proportion of land available in the country or the population already in the country and the many immigrants that are coming in and how we're going to place them among different countries.
As long as we have a definitive system of and keep track of these refugees and immigrants that come in, we they're living here, they're staying here, they're going to the grocery store here. As long as we monitor them like that, I don't see a problem in letting them in. And I would feel a lot better about that 1 to 10,000 ratio that I said earlier. If as long as the systems are in place that monitors their livelihoods in America.
Ms. Hoffman, what do you think? Where is your level of security?
It's like I have to agree with both of them as well. The level of security, I don't really have. I don't have that 1 out of every 10. I think that that 1 can cause thousands. I just have this thought in my head that there is I don't think that there's just one out of every 10. I think that there's always like two, or there's three out of every 10, or five out of every 20. I don't think that there's just this one. There's not this just one terrorist. They come in packs. They're not just a one individual. They're not lone wolves. These ISIS are people that that form in packs, and they attack at in any moment together. They might spread out, but they all do it at one time.
So then, from your perspective, the threat is so high, the chance for damage is so great, the power and ability of our foe is so tremendous that we should not let any of the refugees in whatsoever.
I think that we should, but I think that the precautions that our states are taking, there are some states that are refusing to take them, and I'm glad I am in a state that is not taking them. I don't know, there's just something about it that just, I want to help, and I believe that they're coming to survive. I see children standing in the line, and I would help them with every beat of I possibly can. But I just have this fear of this previous history that we've had that I can't shake, and it terrifies me.
It almost sounds like there's a certain not in my backyard mentality. So in Tennessee today, it may have been late yesterday, one of the legislators suggested that what needs to happen in Tennessee is all refugees from Syria, there have been about 50 of them by government estimates, that all the Syrian refugees have been allowed in Tennessee should be rounded up by the National Guard, should be taken to holding facilities, and should be held basically under something equivalent of internment camps until the crisis is abated. Or perhaps, to get back to the argument that Mr. Costa was making earlier, maybe if we build just one big camp in the middle of Nevada, or in South Dakota, or in Oklahoma, or in Alaska, places where people aren't really living right now, and put them all in that camp and just don't let them out. Would that give you greater security?
I think that's a little harsh. That's not that's a little harsh.
I'm trying to figure out, because this for me personally has been a debate that I think we've all been seeing on our Facebook feeds. And I'm just trying to figure out, where is that comfort level that I as an individual, that we as a country, is it I'd be okay if maybe we build a larger version of Guantanamo Bay and put all 15,000 of them in Cuba. So we'll take care of them, we'll provide for you, just not on our shores.
Imprisonment isn't the answer, and I don't think that we as a country would result to things like that. You have Republicans preaching, we don't want immigrants, we don't want to take refugees, it's too big of a risk. But then you look at the humanitarian side of it and see that these people are suffering, that they do need assistance, and I don't know. I can see how building one big facility or whatever would be beneficial, but it can't look like a prison.
But the two main ideas and proposals being taking place right now could definitely just simplify a a new version of the apartheid that happened in South Africa, or a massive bloodbath that is already taking place in Syria, where we don't really see in the news as much as a Paris attack, but there were hundreds and hundreds of children laying outside schools, already dead, laying in the ground because of the actions already taking place there, because you're not taking those immigrants and refugees out of the country, out of Syria. And those are the two realities that are already being seen right now. So you either choose one or the other, and people are not being able to propose a different approach to the situation.
Let's maybe shift focus a little bit away from how we deal with the refugees, and let's talk about maybe how American foreign policy or French or European foreign policy might be changed by the Paris attacks in light of our own experience with 9/11. How how has Paris responded internationally? Has France's actions towards the Middle East changed? Have their relationships with other countries changed? What have we seen so far on the ground in Syria or in other Middle Eastern countries?
Well, we're seeing.
Attacks have already been taking place. The president have already declared martial law in France, which is, in my opinion, in a drastic and an insane way of dealing with this sort of act. And borders have already been closed in different countries. Belgium is already aligning with France, and you already see this huge ship being already placed in the sea, already planning to attack Syrian territory. So it's just a massive snowball being rolled to this chaos.
As Lucas alluded to, you are seeing France sort of reach out and link arms with her European brothers and sisters, and um, even the United States is offering assistance with the airstrikes and whatnot in the Middle East. Um, U.S. is giving defense suggestions and popular targets for France to hit as far as the concentration of their airstrikes. So, and France is also reaching out to NATO as well, but I don't think anything will come of that because um, if NATO gets involved, ISIS and Russia, and we'll see a lot of the big players in this conflict um, make a big impact. It could possibly lead to another world war.
But that's the thing. What are the actions needed right now? Because if you saw the news right now, the mastermind behind
Hmm.
the attacks have already been killed. So what? At what point are we saying, okay, those measures and those actions are enough, are sufficient, and we're stopping it? Because they already took several actions. They closed the borders, like I said before. They already bombarded some of the cities. They killed the mastermind behind the attack. So right now, what do we do, or what does it mean, those attacks? Is it an opportunity to go ahead and further on and eliminate the threat um, as a whole, or
Well, you as you mentioned, um, the attacks in Paris. That mess has been resolved. They found the mastermind. People are in custody. The people responsible are going to pay for their crimes. But you can't ignore the fact that the reason that this started was because of ISIS and the conflicts in the Middle East. Um, and you're right, it's a slippery slope and it's a tricky situation. At what point do you stop? Do you have another prolonged involvement in the Middle East, and are we knocking on the door of another world war, or do we let Syria handle its own self, and when this terrorist organization starts knocking on our door, we answer, but I don't know what the answer is, and it's an interesting problem that the world is facing today.
It would be different if we hadn't already had this conversation. Now, obviously, I'm a little bit older, and so I have a slightly different perspective than some of you do. But this feels to me like the conversation we had after 9/11. You have the same calls. The only way we can address this problem is if we're fighting the enemy on their territory, not on ours. The only way that we can address this problem is if we close our borders. The only way we can address this problem is by having a multinational or a unilateral organization. What are we after? Are we after justice, whatever that means? Are we after retribution, whatever that means? Are we trying to prevent future attacks, if that's even possible? Like what do we hope to get out of future actions against ISIS?
I don't
that's
know.
another good question. That's a really good question, and I don't think people already are ready to answer it properly. And what we're seeing right now, we're just, at least for me, we're just following the news, expecting something else coming up from government officials and presidents and um, like you said, unilateral decisions or multilateral decisions where you see different groups declaring a war on ISIS or a war on Syria, and I don't know. I can't really tell what they're seeking.
I
Hmm.
think it's a combination of everything. You know, when we're attacked by ISIS, okay, we're seeking retribution, we're seeking vengeance and justice. But as far as I don't know, we see the European refugee crisis that we talked about in weeks past, and how ISIS is becoming more of a fluid state-like entity, and their power is growing as they are unchallenged in the Middle East, and I don't know what the answer is and how to respond to this threat.
And 2 weeks ago, if ISIS would become a state institution, um, I would definitely see a response from the international community to it. But as right now, where you don't see this recognition or this institution being legalized or being directly connected to the state of Syria or Iraq, and it's hard for either countries to declare a war on ISIS, where you see this fluid organization throughout the Middle East. And
I believe that's why we haven't had any kind of prolonged enactment with this certain terrorist organization, because they are fluid. They don't hold to one state, one territory, and as Lucas said, that's when um, the international community would elicit a response.
Again, kind of shifting gears a little bit more. A second ago, Joseph, Mr. Lowe, you had mentioned the possibility of increased NATO involvement. For viewers who may not necessarily be familiar with the problem, according to the NATO alliance, an attack on one is an attack on all. So if NATO, or rather, if France is willing to elevate ISIS to that state-like status that Mr. Costa is referring to, it could actually invoke the NATO Charter. It has not done so.
Hmm.
But what it has done is, for the first time ever, a European country has invoked the Lisbon Treaty provisions that require all other member nations, 27 total nations, to come to its aid and provide whatever military or material support it can to combat the enemy. Do you think that this is going to lead to a greater European conflict directed at Islamic terrorism, at Islamic fundamentalism, at ISIS or Syria? Or do you think that invoking the Lisbon Treaty is really going to be about increased law enforcement, or maybe providing some other kind of resources? Have you heard anything in the news about the intention behind this step on the part of the French?
As you said, they've invoked this section of the Lisbon Treaty, but I haven't heard anything as far as the progression of that. As you mentioned, their European countries are part of the European Union are responsible to provide support to France and other countries who are attacked by a foreign entity or terrorist group. Um, I'm not sure how that's going to affect future attacks and future support given by European countries.
I think it's a matter of it states the need of the French for either you give us a consent for our actions or you align with us in terms of all the measures that we're being we're creating in terms of law enforcement and border security, and then follow up the same guidelines as we are taking. But it creates a whole conflict of how to deal with this problem nationwide, domestically, and as a part of a community. If we were to follow step by step the decisions made by friends, or if we should come up with our own solutions of how to handle the situation and how to approach this whole crisis.
Ms. Hoffman, what do you think?
When it comes to NATO, like you said, if they attack one, they attack all. I believe, it's like he said, like Lucas said, it's a community. I believe that we should all work together. Between Holland and Obama, they came together and they came to an agreement. This was an act of war. They have sent over airstrikes to looking for this mastermind. I think that by working together, that we can, like Russia, and then we got France, and I believe if we all work together, even the United States, that we can actually make a change and probably get rid of ISIS. Yeah.
I typically like to end these broadcasts by taking what we're discussing and turning it into a conversation about the American presidential election, which has apparently already been going on for 2 years, and we still have another year to go. If I were to look at what's happening in the two political parties right now, if I were to listen to what proposals are being presented by the various candidates, it seems like basically 3 different proposals are being developed. And I want to throw these 3 ideas by you, and I want each of you in our final closing minutes to maybe tell me, which do you think the American people will be most attracted to, and therefore which candidates do you think might gain some leverage from this? One option that I see is something maybe you could call it the Bush strategy or the Fiorina strategy. America is the leader of the free world. ISIS is an American problem. America should lead a coalition against ISIS. A second option, and maybe we can call this the more extreme, and maybe this is the Rand Paul option, I don't know, that America should seize this opportunity to pull itself out of the conflict and let others take it over. This is France's problem, this is Russia's problem, this is Syria's problem, this is not my boy Johnny's problem that he should die for. And then you have the third one in the middle, and this is maybe where most candidates are, maybe where Hillary Clinton is. We need to confront ISIS, but we need to do it in some kind of a measured way that probably doesn't involve boots on the ground. Where do you think America is heading in these 3 camps? And which group of candidates do you think benefit the most? The all-ins, the all-outs, or the kind of stay the course that we've been following right now?
I think that people would agree with mostly the first one, because from what I've heard, and I agree as well, that the only way to, I think, because we have been bombing ISIS, for a long time, sending airstrikes over there, bombing certain areas, and obviously we should know that's not taking effect. I think that people would agree more with, like you said, boots on the ground, and if we have people on the ground and then they go in there, I think that we would have more of an impact than just keep throwing airstrikes and bombing over there.
Mr. Costa?
Obama has already used the whole drones idea to fight back the terrorist concept in the Middle East, and as you see right now, people haven't responded back to those attacks in a proper way. So if I believe that if it worded properly and created the whole context to the American society, the Bush approach to this problem would probably be the most well received solution to the problem. I hope it's not the proper solution to it, but that's what I think.
Mr. Lowe, you get the final word.
I would have to say that, we've been in the Middle East for, what, 14 years now, something like that.
Well, depending on when you want to call it, the first Persian Gulf War was in 1991. And
Right.
Americans have been leading airstrikes in Iraq ever since then.
Right. So, personally, I think the American people are a little sick and tired of uh, being involved in the Middle East, and I believe either a Rand Paul option, stop all military involvement in the Middle East, or something like what most candidates are siding with now, and sort of this passive aggressive approach will address the problem, help people addressing the problem, but as long as it's not our problem, stay out of it. And I think that's what appeals with a lot of American people because, as I mentioned before, we are uh, tired of the involvement in the Middle East.
Well, I think if nothing else from this last 45 minutes, we have learned that this is a very difficult problem, one we've been wrestling with really for a long time, and one for which there are no easy answers. We are out of time. Actually, we're a little bit over time, and so I want to thank any of you who are watching live, as well as anybody who may be watching us in the future as part of our live streaming feed. I would also like to remind anybody who may be watching that we are going to be changing our schedule again. Next Thursday is Thanksgiving, and so we're going to be skipping broadcast next week and then returning to a Tuesday broadcast time 2 weeks from today. So again, I would like to thank all of my panelists and anyone who is watching at home, and we do appreciate your attention. God bless.